The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds of Captain George Patterson's modest apartment, casting long shadows across walls adorned with military photographs spanning 6 decades of service. At 85 years old, his weathered hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the collar of his dress uniform, the same navy blue jacket he'd worn to countless ceremonies, now hanging loose on his diminished frame. The reflection staring back from the mirror showed a man whose steel-gray eyes still held the fire of a warrior, though his body bore the weight of battles fought both on foreign soil and within the confines of his own aging heart. This wasn't just another day for Captain George Patterson. This was the culmination of a promise he'd made to himself, a final mission that would take him halfway across the country to witness his great-grandson's graduation from the Air Force Academy, a moment that would close the circle of 3 generations of military service in the Patterson family. Beside him, sitting with the perfect posture of a trained professional, was Radar, a golden Labrador whose intelligent amber eyes seemed to understand the gravity of this day better than most humans ever could. Radar wasn't just a pet, he was Captain George's lifeline, his anchor in a world that had become increasingly unstable as vertigo attacks struck without warning, leaving the proud veteran disoriented and vulnerable in crowded spaces. The dog's massive head tilted slightly as he watched his human struggle with the uniform buttons, and without being commanded, Radar gently nudged George's elbow, providing the steady pressure that helped calm the trembling in his hands. This was their routine, this silent communication between man and animal, a bond forged through 2 years of living together, after the Veterans Administration had matched them, following George's diagnosis with severe vestibular dysfunction and the installation of his cardiac pacemaker. The pacemaker was an older model, one of the last of its generation before technological advances made them more resistant to electromagnetic interference, and George wore a medical alert bracelet that most people overlooked, assuming it was just another piece of elderly jewelry. But Radar knew every detail of his human's condition, had been trained to recognize the subtle signs that preceded a vertigo attack, the way George's breathing would change, how his posture would shift almost imperceptibly before the world began to spin around him. The dog had saved George from countless falls, had learned to position his body as a living crutch, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it materialized. As George carefully folded his travel documents and placed them in his jacket pocket, his fingers lingered on the airline ticket that represented more than just transportation. It symbolized independence, dignity, and the refusal to surrender to the limitations that age and illness had tried to impose upon him. His son had offered to accompany him. His daughter had insisted she could take time off work. But Captain George Patterson had made this journey alone through hostile territory in Vietnam, had navigated the bureaucratic maze of military life for 4 decades, and he would make this final mission on his own terms, with only Radar as his companion and guardian. The apartment itself told the story of a life well lived and a service honorably rendered, with commendations and photographs covering every available surface. But it was the small details that revealed the current reality of George's existence. The furniture had been rearranged to create clear pathways for moments when vertigo struck. Grab bars had been installed in strategic locations, and Radar's bed was positioned within arm's reach of George's chair, ready to provide stability at a moment's notice. The refrigerator held a week's worth of pre-prepared meals, evidence of George's determination to maintain his independence despite the well-meaning concerns of family members who worried about his ability to care for himself. But today was different. Today was about proving that Captain George Patterson still had fight left in him, still had missions to accomplish and promises to keep. His great-grandson, Michael, had sent him a handwritten letter 6 months ago, an old-fashioned gesture that had touched George's heart in ways that text messages and emails never could. The young man had written about following in the family tradition, about how stories of his great-grandfather's service had inspired him to choose the military path, and how much it would mean to have George present at his graduation ceremony. That letter had been the catalyst for this journey, the motivation that had driven George through months of preparation and planning, working with his doctors to ensure he was physically capable of traveling, coordinating with the airline to accommodate Radar's presence, and most importantly, steeling himself mentally for the challenges that lay ahead. If you've ever wondered about the incredible bond between humans and their service animals, about the depths of loyalty and intelligence that our 4-legged companions possess, then you've come to the right place. Here at Lab of Love, We explore the most remarkable stories of courage, devotion, and the extraordinary lengths to which animals will go to protect the humans they love. Make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell, because today's story will leave you speechless and remind you why the relationship between humans and dogs is truly one of life's greatest miracles. The taxi ride to the airport was a test of endurance in itself, with George gripping Radar's harness as the vehicle navigated through morning traffic, the stop and start motion triggering waves of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him before his journey had even begun. Radar seemed to sense his human's distress, pressing his warm body against George's leg, providing the physical contact that helped ground the veteran when the world began to tilt and spin. The driver, initially chatty and eager to discuss the weather and local sports teams, had fallen silent after observing the obvious connection between the elderly passenger and his service dog, somehow understanding that this was a sacred space where words were unnecessary and presence was everything. As the airport terminal came into view, George felt his heart rate increase, not from excitement but from apprehension, knowing that the next few hours would test every coping mechanism he had developed over the past 2 years. The modern airport was a sensory assault course designed by people who had never experienced the disorientation of severe vertigo. A maze of bright lights, echoing announcements, moving crowds, and electronic displays that could trigger an attack faster than enemy fire had ever threatened him in combat. But George had prepared for this moment, had practiced visualization techniques with his therapist, had run through contingency plans with Radar's trainer, and had armed himself with the determination that had carried him through 5 decades of military service. The terminal doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and immediately George was hit by the overwhelming cacophony of modern air travel. Hundreds of voices blended into an incomprehensible buzz, punctuated by the rhythmic announcements from gate agents, security personnel, and automated systems warning about unattended baggage and suspicious activity. The fluorescent lighting created harsh shadows and reflected off polished surfaces in ways that made George's eyes water, and his inner ears struggled to maintain equilibrium. Children cried, adults argued into cell phones, luggage wheels clicked and clattered across tile floors, and somewhere in the distance, construction noise added another layer to the auditory chaos. Radar immediately shifted into working mode, his body language changing from relaxed companion to focused professional as he assessed the environment and calculated the safest path through the crowd. The dog's training had prepared him for environments like this, but nothing could have fully prepared either of them for the sheer intensity of a major international airport during peak travel season. George felt his breathing become shallow, his vision starting to narrow at the edges as the first warning signs of a vertigo attack began to manifest. But Radar was already responding, gently guiding his human toward a quieter area near the wall, where the sensory input would be less overwhelming. The check-in process was a bureaucratic nightmare that tested George's patience and triggered memories of military red tape that had frustrated him throughout his career. The airline agent, barely old enough to have been born when George was completing his final tour of duty, seemed genuinely confused by the concept of a service animal, and spent 20 minutes consulting supervisors and reading policy manuals before finally issuing boarding passes and tags for Radar's documentation. George maintained his military bearing throughout the ordeal, answering questions with the precision and courtesy that had been drilled into him decades ago. But inside he felt the familiar frustration of being treated as a problem to be solved rather than a customer to be served. The walk to the security checkpoint was a journey through a landscape designed to process thousands of people per hour with maximum efficiency and minimum humanity. Signs in multiple languages provided instructions that seemed to change with each step. Electronic displays showed wait times and gate changes that created constant motion as travelers adjusted their plans, and the smell of fast food mixed with industrial cleaning products created an olfactory environment that was simultaneously familiar and alien. George found himself relying more heavily on Radar's guidance as they navigated through the crowd, the dog's presence providing both physical stability and psychological comfort in an environment that seemed designed to strip away dignity and individual identity. Other travelers cast curious glances at the elderly man in the military dress uniform, some with recognition and respect for his obvious veteran status, others with the impatience of people who saw him as an obstacle to their own urgent journeys. A few attempted to pet Radar without permission, apparently unaware that service animals should never be distracted while working. But the dog maintained his professional demeanor, acknowledging their presence without allowing his attention to waver from his primary responsibility. George politely but firmly educated these well-meaning individuals about service animal etiquette, drawing on reserves of patience that had been tested by decades of dealing with civilians who didn't understand military culture. The security checkpoint loomed ahead like the final boss in a video game, a gauntlet of metal detectors, X-ray machines, uniformed agents, and procedures that seemed to change without notice based on threat levels and policy updates that no one fully understood. George had researched the process extensively, had spoken with Veterans Administration counselors about what to expect, and had even practiced at home with radar. But nothing could have prepared him for the reality of Transportation Security Administration protocols applied to an elderly veteran with a cardiac pacemaker and a service animal during one of the busiest travel days of the year. The line moved with glacial slowness, a shuffling procession of humanity reduced to suspects until proven innocent, and George felt his anxiety building with each step toward the checkpoint. His medical alert bracelet felt heavier on his wrist. The pacemaker in his chest seemed to pulse more noticeably, and the cacophony of the terminal grew louder and more disorienting as his stress levels increased. Radar sensed the change in his human's condition, occasionally looking up with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to ask if they should find an alternative route, if this mission was worth the risk to George's health and stability. But Captain George Patterson had not survived combat, military bureaucracy, and 2 years of learning to live with chronic illness just to turn back at the first sign of difficulty. This was his final mission, his last chance to stand in dress uniform and represent 3 generations of Patterson family military service, and he would complete it regardless of the obstacles that stood in his way. He straightened his shoulders, adjusted his jacket to display his service ribbons properly, and prepared to face whatever challenges the security checkpoint would present. The TSA agent who directed them toward the screening area was young enough to be George's great-grandchild, with the crisp efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of travelers but lacked the experience to recognize when standard procedures needed to be modified for special circumstances. His name tag read Agent Morrison, and his uniform was pressed with military precision, which George appreciated even as he recognized the signs of someone who followed protocols without understanding their purpose or limitations. Agent Morrison glanced at Radar's service animal documentation, nodded with the practiced indifference of someone who saw dozens of service animals every day, and began reciting the standard instructions for travelers with medical devices. But something was different about today's security procedures, something that George's research hadn't prepared him for, and that Agent Morrison seemed eager to implement without fully explaining. Instead of directing George toward the traditional metal detector, which would have been the appropriate choice for someone with a pacemaker, Agent Morrison pointed toward a newer, more sophisticated scanning device that George had never seen before. The machine was larger, more imposing, with multiple sensors and displays that suggested technological capabilities far beyond simple metal detection, and the warning signs posted nearby mentioned electromagnetic fields and medical device compatibility in language that was both technical and deliberately vague. George felt his heart rate spike as he realized that this new scanner might pose a threat to his pacemaker, that the electromagnetic fields generated by advanced security technology could potentially interfere with the device that kept his heart beating in proper rhythm. His medical alert bracelet contained specific warnings about such devices, and his cardiologist had provided detailed instructions about avoiding certain types of electronic equipment. But Agent Morrison seemed either unaware of these concerns or unwilling to deviate from his assigned protocols to accommodate them. Radar sensed the change in George's physiological state immediately, the way his breathing became more rapid and shallow, the slight tremor that began in his hands, and the subtle shift in posture that indicated an impending vertigo attack. The dog moved closer to his human, pressing his body against George's leg in a gesture that provided both physical support and emotional comfort. But his intelligent eyes were focused on the scanning device with an intensity that suggested recognition of a potential threat. Something about the machine's low-frequency hum, or perhaps the way other travelers emerged from it looking disoriented, had triggered Radar's protective instincts in a way that went beyond his training. Agent Morrison, Interpreting George's hesitation as typical elderly confusion rather than legitimate medical concern, began speaking louder and more slowly, as if volume and condescension could overcome the communication gap that was developing between security protocol and individual need. He gestured impatiently toward the scanner, clearly eager to maintain the flow of travelers through his checkpoint and unwilling to take the time necessary to understand why this particular passenger might require special accommodation. Other travelers in line behind them began to murmur with impatience, creating additional pressure for George to comply with instructions that could potentially put his life at risk. The moment of truth arrived with the mechanical precision of military timing that George recognized from decades of service. But this time, he was not the one giving orders or following commands from superior officers who understood the stakes involved. Agent Morrison stepped forward, taking George's arm with the casual assumption of authority that comes from wearing a uniform and having the backing of federal regulations, and began guiding him toward the scanner that represented potential disaster for his cardiac pacemaker. The electromagnetic fields generated by the device could disrupt the delicate electronic signals that regulated George's heartbeat, potentially causing cardiac arrest in a crowded airport far from adequate medical facilities. But radar had been watching, evaluating and preparing for this moment with the tactical awareness of a military strategist and the protective instincts of a guardian who would never allow harm to come to his human. As Agent Morrison attempted to guide George into the scanner, radar made a decision that would change everything, demonstrating a level of intelligence and situational awareness that would leave everyone present speechless and redefine their understanding of what service animals could accomplish when their humans were in mortal danger. The Golden Labrador planted his feet with the immovable determination of a concrete barrier, lowering his center of gravity and distributing his weight in a way that made it physically impossible to move him without significant force. His massive frame, trained muscle, and stubborn intelligence combined to create a living roadblock that brought the entire security process to a grinding halt. Agent Morrison tugged on the leash, expecting the typical compliance of a well-trained service animal. But radar refused to budge, his amber eyes fixed on the scanning device with an intensity that communicated danger more clearly than any human words could have conveyed. This was not the passive resistance of a tired or confused animal. This was the calculated defiance of a professional who recognized a threat to his human and was willing to risk everything to prevent a catastrophe that only he seemed to understand. Radar's body language spoke volumes to anyone trained to read canine communication, his posture indicating not stubbornness or disobedience, but the focused determination of a guardian who had identified a clear and present danger. His ears were forward, his tail was still, and every muscle in his body was tensed for action, ready to escalate his resistance if necessary to protect Captain George Patterson from the invisible threat posed by the electromagnetic scanner. Agent Morrison's frustration was palpable as he realized that his routine security checkpoint procedure had been disrupted by what he perceived as an uncooperative service animal, but what was actually a life-saving intervention by a dog whose training and instincts had identified a threat that human protocols had failed to recognize. The agent's voice rose with irritation as he demanded compliance, clearly viewing Radar's resistance as a challenge to his authority rather than a protective response to a genuine medical emergency. Other TSA personnel began to take notice of the commotion, their attention drawn by the unusual sight of a service animal refusing to follow standard procedures. If you're as amazed as I am by Radar's incredible intelligence and protective instincts, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think about this extraordinary display of canine awareness. Have you ever witnessed a service animal demonstrate this level of understanding and courage? Share your experiences below, and don't forget to subscribe to Lab of Love for more incredible stories of the bond between humans and their animal companions. The standoff continued with the inexorable tension of a military engagement, two opposing forces locked in a conflict where neither side fully understood the other's motivations, but both were absolutely committed to their positions. Agent Morrison represented the authority of federal security protocols, procedures designed to protect thousands of travelers from potential threats, while Radar embodied the ancient covenant between human and dog, the promise of protection that transcends rules and regulations when life hangs in the balance. The other travelers in line watched with growing curiosity and impatience, some checking their phones for flight times, others craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. but none of them understanding that they were witnessing one of the most remarkable displays of interspecies communication and protection ever recorded. George stood between them, feeling the familiar disorientation of a vertigo attack beginning to manifest as stress and sensory overload triggered his vestibular dysfunction, but also recognizing something extraordinary in Radar's behavior that went far beyond normal service animal responses. The dog had never before refused a direct command or resisted guidance from authorized personnel, but his current stance suggested a level of understanding and determination that transcended his training. George's military experience had taught him to trust the instincts of his subordinates when they identified threats that weren't immediately apparent to command authority, and every instinct told him that Radar was trying to communicate something critically important about the scanner that loomed before them. The electromagnetic scanner hummed with barely audible energy, its sophisticated sensors and detection systems creating fields of invisible force that could penetrate clothing, identify concealed objects, and potentially disrupt the delicate electronic balance that kept George's heart beating in proper rhythm. The warnings posted near the device mentioned medical device compatibility, but in language so technical and vague that most travelers would dismiss them as routine legal disclaimers rather than serious safety considerations. Agent Morrison had processed hundreds of travelers through this particular scanner without incident, but none of them had been elderly veterans with older model pacemakers that were particularly vulnerable to electromagnetic interference. Radar's resistance escalated to active communication, as he realized that passive refusal was insufficient to convey the urgency of the situation to the humans around him. With deliberate precision that demonstrated remarkable intelligence and training, the Golden Labrador began a sequence of actions designed to communicate specific information about George's medical condition and the threat posed by the scanner. First, he gently nudged George's chest with his nose. Not a random gesture of affection, but a targeted indication of the exact location where the pacemaker had been surgically implanted, pointing out the source of vulnerability that made the electromagnetic scanner potentially lethal. The specificity of Radar's actions was breathtaking in its precision and purpose, each movement calculated to convey maximum information to human observers who might otherwise dismiss his behavior as simple animal stubbornness. After indicating the location of the pacemaker, Radar used his nose to lift the sleeve of George's jacket, exposing the medical alert bracelet that most people overlooked, but which contained critical information about his cardiac condition and electromagnetic sensitivity. The dog's movements were gentle but insistent, designed to draw attention to the medical warnings without causing additional stress to his already vulnerable human. Agent Morrison watched these actions with growing confusion and irritation, interpreting Radar's communication attempts as elaborate displays of disobedience rather than sophisticated efforts to prevent a medical emergency. His training had prepared him to deal with uncooperative travelers, suspicious behavior, and security threats, but nothing in his experience had equipped him to recognize and respond to a service animal's attempt to communicate vital medical information through deliberate physical actions. The agent's frustration mounted as his checkpoint procedures were delayed by what he perceived as an unnecessary complication that could be resolved by simply forcing compliance with standard protocols. But Radar was not finished with his communication efforts, and his next action would demonstrate a level of situational awareness and problem-solving ability that would leave everyone present struggling to comprehend what they had witnessed. After clearly indicating George's medical condition and the source of his vulnerability, the Golden Labrador turned his attention to the electromagnetic scanner itself, fixing his intelligent amber eyes on the device with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. He stared at the machine for several seconds as if calculating its threat potential, and then delivered a single sharp bark that cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a gunshot. This was not the random vocalization of an excited or stressed animal. This was a deliberate warning signal, delivered with the precision of a military alert and the urgency of a fire alarm. Radar had been trained to remain silent in public spaces unless specific circumstances required vocal communication, and his decision to break that protocol indicated that he had escalated the situation to the highest level of threat response in his behavioral repertoire. The bark was followed by continued staring at the scanner, creating an unmistakable connection between his vocal warning and the specific source of danger he had identified. The commotion had attracted the attention of TSA Supervisor Martinez, a veteran security officer whose 20 years of airport experience had taught him to distinguish between routine complications and genuine emergencies that required immediate attention and creative problem-solving. Unlike Agent Morrison, Supervisor Martinez had worked with enough service animals to recognize the difference between behavioral problems and protective responses, and something about Radar's specific sequence of actions triggered his professional instincts to investigate further, rather than simply enforce compliance with standard procedures. Supervisor Martinez approached the situation with the measured caution of someone who had learned that unusual circumstances often contained hidden complexities that weren't immediately apparent to less experienced personnel. He observed Radar's continued resistance, noted the specific way the dog was indicating George's chest and medical bracelet, and recognized that the animal's behavior was too purposeful and targeted to be dismissed as simple disobedience. His years of experience had taught him that service animals were trained to communicate in specific ways, and that their handlers often relied on subtle signals that could be easily misunderstood by people unfamiliar with their working relationship. The supervisor's arrival marked a turning point in the standoff, bringing adult supervision and experienced judgment to a situation that had been escalating toward potential conflict between security protocols and medical necessity. Martinez had seen enough medical emergencies in airport settings to recognize the signs of genuine distress, and George's pale complexion, shallow breathing, and obvious disorientation suggested that stress was triggering the medical conditions that Radar had been trained to monitor and protect against. The supervisor's military background also helped him recognize George's veteran status and the significance of his dress uniform, creating an additional layer of respect and understanding that had been missing from Agent Morrison's approach. Supervisor Martinez knelt down to examine George's medical alert bracelet more carefully, reading the detailed warnings about electromagnetic sensitivity and pacemaker compatibility that most people would dismiss as routine medical information. His training had included modules on medical device interactions with security equipment, and he immediately recognized that the newer electromagnetic scanners could potentially interfere with older pacemaker models in ways that could be life-threatening. The realization that Radar had somehow identified this specific threat and taken action to prevent a medical emergency left the supervisor stunned and impressed by the animal's intelligence and protective capabilities. The moment of recognition was like watching puzzle pieces fall into place, as Supervisor Martinez understood that Radar's resistance wasn't behavioral, but protective, that the dog had identified a genuine threat to his human's life and was willing to risk punishment and physical force to prevent a potentially fatal interaction between George's pacemaker and the electromagnetic scanner. The supervisor's respect for the service animal's intelligence and dedication was matched by his professional obligation to ensure passenger safety, leading him to make the decision that would validate Radar's warning and save George's life. With quiet authority that immediately diffused the tension of the situation, Supervisor Martinez directed George and Radar away from the electromagnetic scanner toward an alternative screening area where manual inspection procedures could be safely conducted without risking interference with medical devices. His calm professionalism and obvious understanding of the situation helped restore George's confidence and allowed Radar to relax his defensive posture, though the dog remained alert and watchful until his human was safely through the security checkpoint and away from potential electromagnetic threats. The manual screening process was thorough but respectful, conducted by experienced personnel who understood the importance of accommodating travelers with medical conditions and service animals without compromising security effectiveness. George's pacemaker was verified through documentation rather than electronic detection. His medical alert bracelet was carefully examined and its warnings noted in official records, and Radar was allowed to remain at his human side throughout the process, providing the stability and comfort that had become essential to George's ability to function in stressful environments. As word of the incident spread among TSA personnel, a crowd of agents and supervisors gathered to witness the conclusion of what would become legendary among airport security staff, as the day a service dog outsmarted their electronic systems and potentially saved a passenger's life through pure intelligence and determination. The story would be retold countless times, with each version emphasizing different aspects of Radar's remarkable behavior. But all versions would agree that the Golden Labrador had demonstrated situational awareness and problem-solving abilities that surpassed those of the human personnel responsible for passenger safety. Agent Morrison, chastened by the realization that his insistence on following standard procedures could have resulted in a medical emergency or worse, apologized to George for his initial dismissiveness and expressed genuine amazement at Radar's ability to identify a threat that trained security personnel had missed. The young agent's education in the complexities of his job had been dramatically expanded by witnessing firsthand how service animals could provide layers of protection and awareness that electronic systems and human procedures might overlook. The other travelers who had witnessed the standoff began to understand that they had observed something truly extraordinary, a display of interspecies communication and protection that challenged their assumptions about animal intelligence and the depths of the bond between humans and their service companions. Conversations broke out throughout the security area as people shared their amazement at what they had seen, with many expressing newfound respect for service animals and the critical roles they play in their handlers' daily survival and independence. George himself was overwhelmed by the realization of how close he had come to a potentially fatal encounter with technology that was designed to protect travelers, but could have killed him due to his specific medical vulnerability. His gratitude toward Radar was profound and wordless, expressed through gentle touches and quiet words of appreciation that the dog accepted with the dignified acknowledgement of a professional who had successfully completed a critical mission. The veteran's respect for his canine partner reached new depths as he understood that Radar had not only identified a threat that humans had missed, but had been willing to risk punishment and physical force to protect his human from danger. The remainder of their journey through the airport passed without incident, but the story of Radar's fierce standoff with TSA security began to spread through social media and news outlets as witnesses shared their amazement at what they had observed. Videos captured on cell phones showed portions of the confrontation, though none could fully convey the intelligence and determination that Radar had displayed in his efforts to protect George from a threat that existed beyond the range of human perception, but well within the sophisticated sensory awareness of a highly trained service animal. This incredible story reminds us all of the extraordinary intelligence, loyalty, and protective instincts that our animal companions possess, often surpassing our own ability to recognize and respond to threats that could endanger our lives. Radar's fierce standoff with TSA agents wasn't defiance, it was devotion, a demonstration of the depths to which our four-legged guardians will go to keep us safe, even when we don't understand the dangers they've identified. If this story has touched your heart the way it has mine, please hit that like button, share it with everyone you know, and make sure to subscribe to Lab of Love for more incredible tales of the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment when your pet or service animal seemed to know something you didn't? When their instincts saved you from danger you never saw coming? Share your stories below, because these connections between species are some of the most beautiful and powerful forces in our world, and they deserve to be celebrated and remembered. Captain George Patterson made it to his great-grandson's graduation ceremony, where he stood in his dress uniform with Radar at his side, representing 3 generations of military service, and demonstrating that age, illness, and disability need not define the limits of what we can accomplish when we have loyal companions who believe in our missions as much as we do. The young cadet who received his commission that day was inspired not only by his great-grandfather's lifetime of service, but by the story of how an extraordinary dog had protected a beloved family member through intelligence, courage, and unwavering devotion that exemplified the very best of the military values that had shaped the Patterson family for generations. And somewhere in airports around the world, TSA agents tell the story of the day a golden Labrador named Radar proved that the most sophisticated security technology is no match for the ancient wisdom and protective instincts of a dog who loves his human enough to risk everything to keep him safe, reminding us all that the greatest security we'll ever know comes not from machines or procedures, but from the loyal hearts that choose to stand guard over our lives, asking nothing in return except the chance to serve, protect, and love without limits or conditions.